Welcome everybody to our webinar today, Budgeting for Nonprofits and How to Think Budgeting and Plan for Success, presented by Unis Solutions and Forvis, audit, tax, and consulting firm. So we're gonna go ahead and jump into this and get started and have a good discussion over all things budget related. So if you wanna go ahead and advance that, just as a little housekeeping note, I guess you can put questions in the Q&A as we go forward, and as we see some of those pop up, we might be able to address those. So yeah, welcome everybody. So our two presenters today, myself, Brian Walker, I am the Director of Nonprofits at Unis Solutions, and specifically with our Questica budget solution. I've been working with nonprofits over 20 years, started out my career as an accountant, moved into ERP implementations, and then moved into the sales role a number of years ago. So Unis Solutions is a software solution provider to nonprofit, public sector, and education organizations, including budgeting, grant management, procurement, special education administration, and a few other applications. So I'll hand it over to Andrew to go ahead and introduce himself.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm Andrew Haro. I'm a senior managing consultant here at Forvis. I'm a member of our nonprofit advisory services team. Forvis is obviously the number 8 audit, tax, and consulting firm in the country. Our team specializes in supporting nonprofits and their many needs outside of an audit and tax return, and providing those unique solutions that nonprofits need to fit their missions and further their goal. My background, I am a CPA. I've been serving nonprofits in any organization over 13 years. I have a background in audit, tax, and I spent some time in industry before coming back to consulting to help nonprofits, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today. Jump right in. So kind of where we want to go today. So we're just going to start off with some objectives, and then we're just going to go through the life cycle of budgeting. And we're going to end up with a little preview of what Questica software can do and how it might be able to help your organization. So just what we hope to get out of today, and what we hope to instill in all of you who joined us today. We really want to help you plan for success through budgeting. A budgeting process cannot be an easy one, and I'm sure, as some of you know, budgeting can go all year round. It never seems to end. It seems to either you're setting your budget for your fiscal year, or you're doing a reprojection, or next thing you know, your fiscal year ended and you're resetting the budget for the following year. So kind of how to plan for that and do that properly to make budget more of a task than, I think, for a lot of nonprofits, is a burden, and it's just something everybody dreads. We're also going to identify some resources that we've seen as common missteps. Where do nonprofits go wrong during the budgeting process, and what are some ways to mitigate those things, and some ideas, some solutions, and just some things we can throw at you in the next hour that might be able to help with those common problems we see. And then obviously we are going to end up, because we are here with our friends at Unis today in Questica, how a budgeting software can really assist not only in setting that budget, but managing that budget throughout the year, and having that data in a centralized place to be able to make those decisions for your nonprofit, for your public sector organization, so you can fulfill that mission, which is what we're all here to do at the end of the day. So that's kind of what our plan is for today.
Great.
That kind of brings us to our first poll question, which will launch on the system. And on a scale of 1 to 3, how effective or efficient do you feel your current budgeting process is? Give a few more seconds for people to answer. And it looks like the overwhelming number is what I felt like when I was in industry. It's effective, but it could be better. I don't think I've ever met anyone that says their budget's extremely effective. And if they are, I don't know why you're taking the hour with us here today, but it seems like about the majority of you, it looks like about 88% says effective, but could be more efficient. That's what we hope to instill in you today, is how to be more efficient.
Yeah, interesting that nobody, at least up to, nobody picked the very first one, extremely effective and efficient.
Then I've been hoping to learn a few things from them. So really, this is what we see as kind of the life cycle to a nonprofit budget, and how to kind of get to where to start, how to resource plan, how to figure out what are your ongoing activities throughout the year, how to manage that budget throughout the year, whether through reforecasting or even simple budget to actuals. You'd be surprised the number of nonprofits I service that the people in the field don't have budget to actuals. I have people in kind of affordable housing that are sending in invoices for their house to fix the heating pipes, don't know if it's in budget because they don't have a budget to actual report. They just kind of submit the invoice and cross their fingers. And obviously that is not good management. Kind of figuring out how to plan your budgets and how to have very specific line items, because we see one of the places that organizations fall flat is their budgets are vague and hard to kind of maintain. There's just like a pool of money for professional fees. That could mean so many things. When you're trying to budget, it's being more specific and being more thoughtful about what you're trying to spend money on, especially in the nonprofit and public sector space, because resources aren't unlimited like they might be in the for-profit. We need to make sure we're using our money correctly so that any excess funds can go to that mission to help more people. And just figuring out like where our resources are being spent. So this is what we're going to kind of walk through today and help you along the way. So the biggest question I had when I was in industry is, where do I start with my budget? Like, how do I even begin budget season? Because every time I got to, we were a calendar year end, we'd get to September, my CFO goes, let's kick off budgeting. And I'd always go, no. Just because there's so much that can come with budgeting, it can be overwhelming, especially depending on the complexity of your organization, depending on how you do it. I know a lot of nonprofits rely on that series of Excel spreadsheets that happen to interweave together, and you just hope for the best. I would always hope that everything came together, and when we went back and sent the budget sheets out, everything's still added. Or when we presented to the board, that my totals were still good. And just figuring out how you're doing that, and just figuring out the best place to start. So what we've come up with is a few questions to ask. The first question is really, who is involved in our budgeting process? And I know some of you might be from where I came from, which is the finance end. I think we're the best. Everything runs through finance. Finance is the best. But when you think about budgeting, especially at a nonprofit, budgeting cannot be a closed off process. We need to involve management. We need to involve programs. We need to involve development in a lot of cases, figure out what the resources we have to spend. So figuring out who needs to be at the table for these budget discussions is key, because making sure they understand, okay, what is the timeline? What is our process? What are our goals? Rather than springing on them, and I see so many nonprofits, they send out that budget sheet. Hey, get me your budget for next year in 2 weeks. Without telling them, hey, here's what we hope to accomplish. Are we doing business as usual? What are our initiatives? Who are we trying to reach new? And that brings us to the second question. Once we know the who, the next question is the what. What are our goals and objectives for our budget? What are we trying to do next year, especially in a nonprofit? We have our mission. How are we trying to further that mission? Are we in a state where we just want to go, you know what? We're just going to do what we've been doing and do it really well. Or is the goal for next year to open up new programs, reach new people, open up new locations? Knowing all that and knowing what the organizational goals are going to help that budget to know, hey, we need to allocate 10% for this new location we're trying to get off the ground for our after school program. That has to be budgeted for on both the revenue and expense side. We'll get to that. The next is, what is the timeline for your budget? Usually in most organizations, especially nonprofits, the timeline is going to be set by when the board of directors is going to meet to approve a budget. And it's usually working backwards. So it's usually board of directors meets at the end. If you're a calendar year end in November, that's when we need our budget done. So we need to start our budget conversation. And I know it sounds crazy to some people, in August. We need to kick off that budget season to have everything sewed up by November and everybody to feel good about it and have the proper time to really think about what we want to do. Also, some other things to consider. Like I said, what are your strategic initiatives? But also, are you an organization that aims for zero budgeting, which is we're going to spend every revenue dollar we get on an expense, whether it's a capital asset expense or a regular business as usual, other than personnel. But we really, our goal is to budget to zero. And is that the goal? Or is the goal to set up, hey, here's what we need to function. Let's talk to the development team or our program team about what our revenue streams are coming in. And figuring out kind of where you want to end up before the budgeting process starts. It just gives people a sense of what we're actually trying to do when you ask them, hey, what do you want to spend next year? Because the last thing you want to do is get their budget sheet back that has all these asks, all these things, and then either finance or management just has to start slashing because you didn't have the conversation at the beginning to set priorities. And it just makes those conversations easier. And I've seen it in practice. It makes finance less of a bad guy at the end of the day if we can have these. So really planning just leads to, like everything in life, having the right plan just makes everything that much easier.
Hey, Andrew, to jump in with a quick question, do you see more organizations these days planning for reserves and keeping something in reserve as opposed to more that, we're going to spend everything type of approach?
It really does depend on the organizations. What I will say is the organizations that take the proper planning when it comes to budgeting usually are the ones that have those reserves, because you're able to think through things and plan. And I'm sure if there's anybody on the development side on this call, knowing 6 months in advance that I need to raise an extra $500,000 rather than knowing in November I have to raise an extra $500,000 just makes it easier, and knowing that you have that time. So the organizations that we see have that good reserve are usually the ones that plan their budget better. So thinking about nonprofits, it's really thinking about this mission-focused budget. Because at a nonprofit, at the end of the day, we are aiming to serve our constituents, whatever our nonprofit is for, and the public sector. We are aiming to help people. We're not aiming for a dividend. We're not aiming for a higher salary for our CEO. We are aiming to help people. So the budget should relate back to the organization's mission plus admin, and we'll get to that, but really thinking about how are these expenses going to further the mission? How can we invest in our people to get the most out of our programs, the most out of every dollar spent? And some of that is going to be investments internally that on the face of it, it's like, why are we spending this money? But we've all seen the landscape of nonprofits. It's not always a pretty one. So being able to invest in the people we have to make sure we have the best people to carry out our mission, that's something when thinking about a budget. How can we further what we have? And thinking about all the healthcare, when we're thinking about healthcare organizations, all the cost that comes from that are related to those services, thinking about the providers, our supplies, our facilities, what does it take to run our mission? And get to that first to figure out then what else do we want to do? Making sure it aligns, making sure that the resources, we're allocating them properly. And part of that is, as Brian said, having a reserve for a rainy day. Hey, a pipe burst in one of our FQHC facilities. Are we able to pay a plumber to come out and fix that in an emergency without not having a Christmas party? Do we have those, something happened and we can act on it quickly? Or some organizations also want to have, hey, an opportunity presents itself to further our mission, and we have that reserve. That's a program reserve. Like, there's just an opportunity in the community, and if we jump now, we might be able to raise funds later, but there is a hole to fill our program with. Do we have that? And the other thing here, when thinking about the mission-focused budget, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be budgeting for our admin. We need to pay HR. We need to pay IT. We need to pay finance. Having those costs built in and making sure we're investing in the right platforms. Maybe a great budgeting software is something we want to budget for, so we can have that and know what our costs are. But things like that, although they're not directly tied to their mission, a well-functioning nonprofit just reaches more people because we are doing less things administratively to catch up. And then we're able to have those reports that say, how many people are we touching with these programs and what is the cost? And can we save costs by combining maybe locations or things like that? But without the proper budgeting and the proper tools administratively, we don't have that data to do that. So it's really thinking about how each line item is going to further the organization's mission or its focus. But that also includes it, like I keep going back to this, it also includes investing in the infrastructure of the organization. And we've all seen lean times with COVID. The first thing that'll get cut is a finance platform. No one thinks we need it. If our accounting system works, why do we need AP automation? Why do we need a budgeting software? Why do we need closed management software? But sometimes having some of those things will allow an organization to get that reporting quicker in the hands of decision makers to actually make decisions. So just thinking about those things as we go about budgeting really goes a long way. So the next thing really is resource planning. How are we going to plan our resources? So we thought about what do we want our budget to be? We thought about what needs to be included. We thought about what are the strategic goals of the organization. So now where do we go? How do we plan our resources to move forward? And that brings us to our next poll question. How collaborative is your organization's budget process? This I've seen in nonprofits can go all over the map. I know some it's, hey, we include everybody, but at the end of the day, they give their input and then it goes into the black hole of finance and a CEO, and then the budget gets spit out and everybody's playing catch up of what got caught. And then I've seen the other end where there are so many people involved in the budget process that it never seems to end or nothing seems to get done because everybody is trying to be involved in the budget process, and it just leads to meeting after meeting, and then you're just scrambling 2 days before the finance committee meeting or a board of directors meeting to try to figure that out.
Yeah, kind of interesting results coming through here. So looks like it's got to the end. 68% voted, 88% said that we do include program managers. 13% would like to include others, but don't necessarily have the right tools. And nobody said that they don't wish to include program managers. So positive results there, I would say.
And I would say just if there's any questions, there is a chat feature. Feel free to drop them in there and we can answer them as we go. Yeah, it's interesting. I know a lot of organizations try to include people, but it's also making sure not just their input on inputting the budget, but as the budget gets finalized to make sure. I know sometimes presidents, CEOs, executive directors just kind of make decisions, and then you get that budget back and go, hey, I thought I had this conference to further my staff, to send Brian to so he knows how to function in this program, and it got cut without me knowing. And kind of some of those last minute cuts is also involving people in those. They don't necessarily need to be in the decisions, but letting them know why something happened so that they're aware for next year when they're budgeting.
Yeah, it's also going to be part of what we talk about in these next couple sections as we get to them. The ongoing monitoring of the budget and the reforecasting, which is also a critical part to include those program managers.
Yep. So we've thought about how we want to budget. We've brought people to the table. We have a timeline. We think about what the organization wants to do. The next step for a nonprofit especially is understanding what is available to spend. And a lot of that at nonprofits is understanding what your funding sources are. Is your nonprofit or public sector, are you grants-based? Are you donation-based? Or are you earned income? Do you know, hey, we have this revenue stream that if I'm reaching 100,000 people with my program, each of those is paying me $10 a month. And that's my revenue stream. Do I have multi-year grants where there is money I can rely on? Or am I the type of organization like, hey, every year I bring in $16 million worth of donations, but those are one-year donations, and I have to fight and claw every year to get those. So thinking about as you budget, where are the inflows coming from? And a lot of that is also planning what time of year do those inflows come in. I see a ton of nonprofits, they zero-based budget. So everything in goes out. They present a balanced budget every year, but they are calendar year end and they have a gala in September. So their biggest source of revenue is in September. And every year around May, there is a panic because they feel like they start running out of money. And then the board members go, why are we running out of money? We have a balanced budget, because no one ever thinks about timing. Now we've changed the way they budget. They now factor that in, but thinking about when your revenue streams come in, if you have something like a gala, like a special event, or hey, most of our money comes from fundraising walks that occur in the spring and summer. So we know if we're gonna make capital investments or improvements, maybe that are administratively, those are budgeted for the time of year our revenue comes in, rather than, hey, I don't get my money till September, I'm gonna budget this to pay it in January though. That'll keep your suppliers happy, but that also just like, it's a way to manage cash flow, knowing when your money comes in. I think the other thing to think about when you're thinking about your funding sources is just to remember nothing in life is guaranteed. Now I'm an accountant. I recognize revenue when I have that signed grant agreement that says they're going to give me $1 million over 3 years. The thing to keep in the back of the head is, while I have that agreement and I can take them to court to enforce it, nothing is guaranteed. So thinking about contingencies and maybe that zero-based budgeting isn't good. Maybe we should budget to have that reserve or contingency just in case something falls through, or just in case, hey, somebody's not able to fulfill one of the pledges we were counting on. So to make sure that you can still operate and you're not living day to day by opening the mail and seeing what checks came in and hoping that we're going to be able to pay payroll this week. It just really helps to think about where are our inflows coming to then match it with our outflows. Because we want to make sure there's still money in the bank for a rainy day. I mean, most of us were in the same positions we were in when COVID hit. I remember sitting there, I was in microfinance, we were high touch, and then our program just stopped. Now I was also sitting there with 20 Excel sheets, hoping everything came back with budget, but thinking about, okay, what reserves do we have? Are we going to cover payroll next week? Because our inflows have just stopped. And luckily we had planned for it, planned for a rainy day. Now this was probably more of a thunderstorm, but we were able to recover and go through because we had planned for contingencies. And we weren't just, hey, we are going to zero budget, everything that comes in that goes out, and hopefully nothing bad happens. So then the next part is, so we have who's at the table, when the dinner's happening for budgeting, what are our revenue streams? So now while we're budgeting, we need to allocate our resources effectively. And this really comes to, this is not just monetary money resources. This is also how we're using our people, how we're budgeting their time. Can we get the most out of our people without burning them out? I say the key to, when I look at my staff and schedule them, I schedule them for 85% full time because things always come up. So how can we schedule our people for our program and mission to make sure that they are fulfilling what we need to do, but also that we're going to be able to retain them? And how many people do we need to run our program? What do we need in the background? So thinking about not just committing dollars, but also that time budget. What is the FTE we need at each location, each site, each program? And that goes back to that realistic cash flow. So if our main driver is salary, we need to make sure that we're able to cover everybody's salary. Do we need, hey, in the summer we're busier, so we just know we need to hire temporary workers because we don't have the cash flow to support them full time. And thinking about how we can effectively allocate our resources so that we can budget properly and we have the money we need to fulfill our missions. With that, I will turn it over to Brian.
All right, thanks, Andrew. So we're going to go on here to talk about allocations. So why is it important to allocate costs to programs and grants, and why would we want to do that for the purpose of budgeting? Well, it's the only way that you can see the fully loaded cost of those programs and what the indirect costs or the grants might be covering. And we need to see this from a budgetary perspective, just like we need to do this, on our actuals. We need to certainly allocate the actuals as well. So we'll talk about that a little bit. What steps would we want to take, or what things would we need to consider as we're looking at how we want to allocate these out in the budgeting process? So first, we must consider all the shared costs that we have across the organization. What are we looking at? What are we going to allocate out? And this would include things such as our administrative departments, HR, finance, IT. What are the staffing behind those? And the other admin departments. We have rental costs, maybe building and facility costs, capital items. So all of those different types of things are what you're kind of gathering that up and looking at how you're going to allocate those out to the programs. Next, what we want to consider is what are the best allocation methodologies to apply to these. This is where it starts getting a bit more complex. Staffing costs are usually pretty straightforward. The best methodology, or the most common methodology, is usually to take the number of FTEs in each program, divide those by the total number, and that gives you your percentage, and you can use that as the allocation basis for the staffing costs for the administration side. So the HR, finance, staffing costs, how they're going to allocate out to programs and grants. So for some other areas like rental and facility costs, you might want to do something based on square footage. So square footage can be a bit more complex, especially when you see where you might have a staff member that works in a couple different programs. Maybe that staff member occupies an office that's a 10 by 10 office, so it takes up 100 square feet. How do you work with that? What you'd want to do is take the 100 square feet and have it follow the allocation of that staff member, 50 square feet in each program. And so you're going to get an adequate representation of where that staff member's time is going based on the facility costs you're allocating there as well. This type of stuff can be pretty detailed and tough to track across spreadsheets. And as Andrew mentioned, we'll, towards the end of this, look a little bit at a software solution and how it facilitates some of these different processes. Not that I'm going to dig into the allocations necessarily at that point, but that's where you get some of the help. For other types of facility costs or capital items, you might have different allocations with additional basis. Sometimes we might see those allocated just based on revenues or expenses from each program. You might have other statistical counts, such as total computers. There might be many different allocation bases. The key here really is determine the method that best aligns to the cost you're allocating and really be consistent. So it's not something you can keep changing. Once you've nailed this down, you need to kind of go, unless there's a real reason to change that, keep consistent with what the methodology is. Okay, so next thing that kind of goes along with determining the allocation method is also looking at what level of detail you're going to allocate in. So are you taking entire departments and just allocating those out in summary, and we see that sometimes? Or are you really going through and picking out individual line items within those departments and saying, well, this particular account is best served by this allocation methodology and a different one by a different allocation methodology? Not that it has to go down to every single line item. You could certainly group those, like this set of allocations is best served based on square footage. This one's based on number of computers. This one, again, might be FTE or expenses. But you really kind of have to look through what applies best as an allocation method to those different account types and what's housed in those. Then the last part of it is looking at the recipient side. So what's the pool of recipients? How are we going to define the pool of recipients that are going to receive a piece of this? So this would include your programs, but it can get a bit more complex than this. You might have more of a step-based allocation methodology where your admin departments are being spread out and then shared facility costs are further spread to the associated programs. Those are areas where it can get quite complex. The order of the calculations, the way it runs through those steps, is critical in these cases. Again, quite a lot of complication or complexity on spreadsheets. And then an additional consideration is at the grant level. So far I've just mentioned, okay, we're taking departments out to programs, but grants are certainly a part of this. It depends on how your grants are set up. Do you have indirect cost rates that are set up that are going to calculate the administrative part, or do we need to allocate portions of these administrative costs out to the grants? Or it could be a mix of both. Maybe it's an indirect de minimis 10%, but they can also accept a piece of the allocated dollars up to a certain threshold. So it could be some complications like that as well. So as I mentioned before, you kind of have to work through this methodology. It would be in line typically with what you're doing on the actual side, but once you've set it up, it should remain consistent. Everything should be logically tied back to the most the most meaningful driver for that account type, and then keep it consistent unless there's a real material reason to change that as you go forward. All right, allocations are great. I love allocations, a lot of fun there. So let's go on and talk about the next topic then, which is monitoring your budget on a regular basis. So we've got the ongoing activities. So we've built the budget. Is it enough to go ahead and think that you can just leave that approved budget, till the end of the year and not check back on anything? Probably not a good idea. You really need to be taking a look at that budget throughout the year, seeing how you're tracking. Why is this important? As we've talked about earlier, nonprofits certainly operate with limited resources and cash flows. That's not a shock to anybody. So we need to really strategically plan, where the best application of the dollars will go, and determine if it makes sense to continue with those programs that may not be performing well. The performance could be both in terms of financial results or the programmatic outcomes. So got to look at both sides of things. It might make sense to apply additional support for a program that is running at a loss. if the program is providing the type of outcomes that your organization, sorry, my phone is ringing, disconnect this, that your organization is determined does best benefit the community. So we could have some programs that run at a bit of a loss, and we've determined it makes sense to support those. So is it a fee-for-service program? If so, we need to make sure the services and the reimbursement rates are tracking in line with what was planned. Otherwise, we'll be pulling more resources from the other areas of the organization to cover that particular program, which again can be okay, but strategically you need to think through these things, and does it best align with the outcomes that particular organization is trying to achieve. So looking at the expense side of things, largest area there is obviously staffing, so that's going to be the place to look. What types of things are we looking for there? Do we have staff openings? This may temporarily help the bottom line, but if these are key staff members, if we think of like a fee-for-service program, and these are program staff that are missing, that might keep us from providing the services that that particular program is set up for. And if we're not realizing those revenues, maybe it's costing us more than it's actually saving us in staffing costs, right? So it's not necessarily a good thing that staffing is down. On the other side of it, do we have staffing cost overruns? Could be, paying more for overtime, seasonal staff, part-time staff than we had originally planned for, areas such as that. So we want to keep a close eye on all these types of things, look at each program. How is it performing from a revenue contribution, expense, programmatic outcome view? This will help your organization with their overall strategic planning and adjustments as you go forward through the year. Now, so this goes back to one of our questions: who should be responsible for doing this ongoing monitoring of the budget? We asked the question more so in terms of building the budget initially, but in terms of ongoing monitoring, I think it's always going to be kind of in line with that. If you have, program managers that you determine department program managers, it's not just finance, but these folks are, involved in those areas, so they're the ones best aligned at helping out, with the budget input. Then it goes hand in hand that those should also be the people that are participating in the regular monitoring of the budget. And we definitely see this as we get into larger organizations. I would say what I see in smaller organizations, that's not always the case. Maybe it might be more finance people, but as you get into larger and larger organizations, I've typically seen that it's more, program managers that are involved in that. It's probably two key reasons, I would say. One, finance can only be stretched so far in a large organization. More important than that, as we talked about, the program and department managers are the ones that are close to the numbers. They can provide the insight, the color to finance and management on, what's currently happening in those programs, what's projected to happen in the future, where are they at? So as we look forward, what is the color behind those reports that we're getting? All right, so a little bit there on regular monitoring the budget. So we can move on to another piece of this, which is also budget reforecasting, or the forecasting process. So I've personally heard the term forecasting used, or reforecasting, in a number of different ways over the years, but what we're going to talk about here is really just creating a new version of the budget as you go through the year that's going to now combine the results to date, the actuals to date, with your future periods of the budget. How often will you do a reforecast? Who's involved in the process? What does this process look like? So how organizations do a forecast will vary. I've definitely found that. Some organizations might do just a simple mid-year forecast and that's it. Some may still not do it at all. Others will do it quarterly. Some will do it, kind of the extreme side of things that I've worked with is down to the individual month, where they actually have a forecast process every single month that they're going through and looking at a new version of this budget. So this forecast version really represents a new version of the budget. We're not erasing that original board approved budget by any means. That's always going to be available. We need that available. And typically we're not necessarily even erasing the last version of the forecast. If you want to be able to look back at that, you certainly should be able to, right? So this is a new version altogether, where you're determining what's the latest mix and what are the projections going forward. So each projection is going to be a mix of actual and budget. You might have like 6 and 6 if you're doing that mid-year budget, or a 3 and 9 if you're looking at like a first or third quarter projection where, or no, this first quarter where you have 3 months of actual, nine months remaining. And ideally, the actuals are locked. So as budget managers go in here and work through this process and give their latest projection, you don't want them changing the actual. We do want them participating in this process and going through and giving their latest projections on what things are going to look like to the end of the year. How do you want to go through that process and have people working through it? So the most common approach, I would say, is when you're starting with actuals plus budget, is simply take a copy of the last budget numbers you have and populate those months. That's what we see by far is the most common. So as you're starting the very first projection of the year, the numbers copied into the budget months would simply be a copy of the original approved budget. Maybe that's for the last 9 periods if it's your first quarter, and so forth. But there are some other methodologies that we see out there, might be a bit more complex and maybe something that a software solution would support, where, for example, you can have a solution help you with, what would we have to do for the remainder of the year to hit that original budget number. So maybe for certain types of accounts, you want to see that as your starting point in a projection. So if you're already over budget for the year, it would have to automatically for you reproject the remainder months to reduce those, keep them proportionally, seasonally aligned with what you had. But if you had a $10,000 budget for that line item, you've already spent 6, maybe you had it evenly distributed, then it's going to show you that 4 is available for those line items. So something like that, or maybe you want the system to help you with seasonal trends. So instead of giving me the original budget number, help me by looking at what we've done to date and project based on that same type of linear regression pattern. So do you want it to look at actuals to date? Do you want it to look at budget? You could do that as well. Most of the time it's going to be based on actuals. Is it just year-to-date actuals? You want it to look at an average of the past 2-3 years. So different methodologies we've seen there. When it comes to the staffing involved, you certainly want your the staffing model that you're looking at. You certainly want to provide your latest updates to the staffing model as well. Not that you're going to have these same type of calculations, but what you're looking for there, certain changes around staffing might include new staff that was hired at different points than was originally expected. So you planned on within your program hiring somebody in September and they didn't come on till November, so there's a couple of months savings. Or if by chance you hired somebody early, which we certainly don't see that as often. It could be unexpected staff leaves, for whatever reason, somebody, you didn't realize this person's going to leave, so there's an open position that's going to change your forecast going forward. Could be adjustments to staffing allocations. So maybe the way you had people originally set up to apply their work across the year has changed. Or very common, we have a lot of 7-1 start of year organizations we work with. Their health insurance plans reset on a January basis. So when they're going into that budget year, they may have been taking a guess of what the renewal rates are going to look like. And when the actual rates come out, they're a bit different. So in that latest forecast, they're going to go through and put in whatever the latest benefit rates are. So different types of changes we're going to see there at the staffing level that are going to, potentially provide some big impacts.
And I think, Brian, just to add there, the one thing we do see a lot of nonprofits who budget, I'd say appropriately do, especially when they're donation based, we see a lot of nonprofits will do a business as usual budget. That's what we're doing. And then they have what they call opportunity budgets. That if the fundraising comes in, we can activate this new initiative or this new program. So we see a lot more organizations doing that because they want to do more, but they also want to be cognizant of having that reserve, having those rainy day funds. So we're not going to open the new location unless there's we get an extra $50,000 in fundraising or $500,000 in fundraising. And that part of this reforecasting could be look at our budget to actuals, figuring out what we're going to spend, seeing what that surplus or deficit is, and either go or no go on some of these opportunity budgets, which we see. We don't see it in the for-profit space, but essentially nonprofit, where we want to try new programs to make sure you have those funds before you go. That way, not a part of our original budget, but hey, if the funds are there, we are ready to go. We have the budget, it's all approved. We just need to kind of turn on the faucet, if you will.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, good point. And same with grants too. We certainly see a number of organizations that will build in provisional budgets for grants. It's like, here's the pool of grants that we're sending out proposals for. We may get some of these, not necessarily all of them. So you could build different versions that have kind of what if analysis. What if we got these, 3 or 4 grants, or what does that look like? So yeah, that's a great point. So yeah, the forecasting process is just a great way to regularly monitor your budget. And again, often includes the program managers, and it's different from a simple variance analysis. Like if you're doing actual versus budget variance analysis, that's a look backwards. You're looking at the results to date, but this is a process where you're looking at what's happened to date, but you're using that as a means to look forward. What do you expect to also happen for the rest of the year, not just looking backwards? That's kind of the key difference there. All right, so in the last portion of this, what we actually wanted to jump into, and we can check, did we have any questions? We wanted to jump into, we did have one more poll question that's going to come up at some point. So we're going to move over to talking a little bit about an example of a budget solution, which is our Questica budget solution. So many organizations are still using, spreadsheets, very complex spreadsheets. Some organizations may have a budget tool that is connected with their accounting system. It's a part of their accounting system, and that may provide some solution, some partial solution, but may not necessarily get you all the way there. So I'm going to try to move over to sharing my screen here, if I can get back to this.
While Brian's pulling that up, we've seen a lot of nonprofits. Oh, even the best nonprofits, even the best Excel budgeting spreadsheets you have, as soon as you put something in Excel, it opens it up for danger. I thought my Excel spreadsheet was great until COVID hit, when I was asked every day by my CEO and CFO to modify the scenario. And I remember one day, like 10 days in, the CFO was like, "This is great. Can I see the underlying numbers?" And once again, I said to him, "No," because I did not want anybody looking under the hood, just because it scared even me that I had 8 spreadsheets hoping no formulas got broken. I deleted something here, it might affect the presentation that's going to the board. So just thinking about it, it may seem you might have the best spreadsheet ever, doesn't mean it's a good budget process. I just wanted to add that while you were opening that.
Great point. All right, so we'll take a few minutes here, and we can keep tabs if there's any questions. So this is the Questica budget solution, full cloud-based solution, collaborative. It's very collaborative, so that's kind of what I'll focus on a little bit, I think, just in the time that we have. So it's meant to get all your different team members in the solution, providing not only the numbers but the supporting details, having discussions back and forth, having assigned tasks that go with the workflow and the approvals and all those types of tools. So what we see across the top here is the main navigation. We're landing on the dashboard, where you can certainly set up your typical dashboard types of things. We see the task management, which, as I mentioned, goes with budget approvals and different budget stages. So as I move, as the administrator, as I move budgets into a given stage, like this is the program manager's entry stage, or this is in the finance review stage, each user associated with those budgets would get an email notification. They can follow that into the solution. They're going to have a list of tasks there. They simply click through those, do their work, pass the budgets on to the next stage, and then those tasks pass on to whoever's associated with the work at the next stage of your budget process. This menu right here gives you a navigation into the main parts across the solution: operating, capital project budgeting, personnel, budget requests are some of the main parts. We're going to focus just a couple elements on operating, but do note this is a full personnel budgeting solution too, where you can budget all your positions, the associated calculations, which employees are behind those, how are they allocated across the programs and grants, and all of that. It has a full reporting selection as well. Administration is where we can do all the configuration. It's a very configurable tool. So it would configure to what your chart of accounts looks like, what your budgeting process looks like as well. There's some conveniences over here before I dive into a budget. So direct access to our help center, calendarization of everything. So this connects into your Outlook or your Google Calendar. So as you have those budgeting cycles that are coming up, everybody has that on their calendar. They know what's coming up, just like you have interaction with the tasks out to different users. And then we have our bookmarks here. So just like your browser bookmarks, where each user can go through and identify exactly what, this might have gone to sleep on me while I was sitting here for an hour, so let me log back in.
While you're doing that, there was a question in the chat, Brian. Does it allow for budgeting in multiple currencies and regions?
We do have some ways we can create calculations around different currencies, if that's your need. So what we're looking at here, I'm going to navigate into this cost center, and you can navigate into like individual cost centers. You can certainly see the roll up of the budget across any level of your organizational structure, and you can lock each user out from the cost centers they shouldn't see. The naming is just my naming that I currently have. You can rename everything in the system. So while I currently have these called cost centers, you can call them programs, departments, projects. So within this cost center that we're navigating to, the user would have a couple key things. First, up here at the top, we see the current approval stage of this budget that we're working on. We see that we're working on our care center network. Which budget version are we working in? This is the original. This is where we can see we have the different forecasts that we might go through, and all this would typically be locked out. It's just visible in my demo stage. Up here at the right, as we've done our work, we would ultimately go through and promote this to later stages. So the budget stages are up to you. You can define how many you need, what those are called, who has access to the data at each stage. So I would go through and move this from budget entry to finance review. What else is important behind these stages is that the system automatically takes a snapshot of the data, and the data changes at each stage. So you can put these things side by side. You can see, okay, what was entered at the, at the program manager level, the budget entry level, what changes did I make at finance review or board review? System has audit trails for all this, but you can easily see it in reports, or I can just put it side by side on these screens. So at this point, I'm not going to move that forward. Within the navigation here, we have some options as far as how do we want to work on our budget numbers. Do we want to work on annual going out into future years? Would we rather switch this over to more of a monthly view? We have layout options which determine all of the columns and the row groupings. How much detail or summarization do you want to see? So that's up to you as a user, where you can add your own columns, you can choose your groupings, and you can save those and share them out with different users. Certainly built to do all your entry here on the screen, but you also have behind every single screen built-in connectivity to a spreadsheet. Simply hit export, you'll have this data in a spreadsheet. You want to make changes there, paste new entries, delete rows, whatever it is. You simply pull that same spreadsheet directly back in, and it'll represent your changes in the system.
And we found that with some of our clients, that feature to be able to put things in spreadsheets, especially at nonprofits where you have some more legacy individuals who maybe don't want to learn a new system, having that simple export from the system to be able to let them make their updates in Excel, and we can put it right back in the system. We found it's invaluable, just especially at nonprofits where not everything is as easy as it should be.
Yep. So what we're looking at here, I've got columns currently included for prior actuals for a couple of years. I've got my current year working budget. I've got a variance in here, current year actuals, and we're going to budget by month. The view that I started with over here rolls everything up to summarization level. So if I wanted to expand this out and see which accounts I have at the next level down, we can see that quite easily. But what we can also see behind these different areas are itemizations and details. So we're not budgeting just at the account level. We can enter as many items in there as we like. We can choose how those values are spread across the different months. We can put descriptions with each item. We can attach to those documents or links to outside files. So if you like to store things on SharePoint, just keep the documents residing out there, and this just becomes the link. And then we can have discussions across team members. So I can come in here and attach right to this budget itemization. I can go through and mention one of my team members. So like Doug here, send him a message, please review, very simple message. I can flag that as important. He's gonna get an email notification in his inbox. It's gonna lead him right into this itemization. He can flag that as completed. He can put his own note in. Those types of items that were flagged as important, if they have not yet been completed, when we go to promote this to a later stage, they will pop up and say, hey, you marked this as completed. What would you like to do with this item? All right, so we're building these all up at the itemization level. Other items, like in the staffing area, what we would see as we navigate down here, these are items we can't change. Different users can be locked out of this, but myself as an administrator, what it shows me is that I can navigate down to the supporting details. So it's going to take me down to who exactly is allocated into this budget. And I can see Ace here, who's an accounting assistant, is 50% allocated. I can see Brett is allocated here. He's also allocated to a grant, which I'll talk about in just a second. If I want to open up Brett's record, we're now looking at Brett, who's the preschool teacher, all the drivers of his record, starting date, is there an end date associated, his salary, his workers' comp category. All of these types of fields are configurable. They're going to drive the calculations behind this record. We can see the full of his allocation if we wanted to move over here. Or on this budget screen, we can see the full of his output calculations. So not only his wages, but all his taxes and benefits. All of these screens have the same view options. So do you want to see that annually or monthly within the year? And it's going to have the seasonality built in depending on your pay cycles. So we can see this biweekly one with spikes in certain months. It's going to have the limits behind like unemployment and things like that.
And I think that the really nice thing here is that obviously we plan for personnel. I'm sure anybody who has tried to hire anybody in the past 3 years is not the easiest thing to do. That if say, hey, we budgeted to have a new accountant come on in March and we're not able to hire, we can move it in the system so that when we're doing those reforecasting, it's kind of automatic when we're going to hire and we can move those dates. It makes that personnel, that whole budgeting thing really seamless. Brian, one question from the chat, and I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to throw it to you. What software does Questica integrate with when it comes to accounting, getting the actuals in, putting the budget back into the accounting ERP?
Yeah, good question. We have a lot of flexibility. We've integrated to over 50 different applications at this point. Some of the common ones that we have out of the box integrations that we see in the nonprofit, I'll speak since this is a nonprofit webinar, would be like your Sage Intax, your MIP, your Blackbaud, FENXT solutions. So all of those we have direct API out of the box integrations. Can also integrate to like NetSuites we'll see on occasion, even Workday. All right, so a lot of flexibility there, and the integrations would extend. So the GL integration is certainly the standard typical one, and we're integrating to bring in data to the actual level, so we can drill down to actuals, whether it's here or on the report. But we can also do integrations to HR solutions. Sometimes organizations want to bring in HR data on a regular basis for new budget projections. Sometimes it's a little different need. They want to bring in the actual at the employee level so they can do variance analysis, actual versus budget by staff member. So it could be for either reason that we build out an HR integration. The system can support both of those.
Yeah, and I know from what I've seen from my clients, it's very flexible. Obviously, there are some that are out of the box and ready to go when you purchase it, but I haven't seen one that we haven't been able to work with the team at Questa to get into the system.
Yeah, so one other thing I want to point out here on this screen is, so up here, the coding is representing kind of like a program project and a fund that represents the overall cost center or budget area we're working in. Now, obviously, we have the accounts down here. We can have as many additional columns of coding, dimensions, segments coming across from your accounting system, or they don't even have to be coming across from your accounting system. They could be segments that you budget for, like what are the strategic outcomes that we're budgeting against, you know, any of those additional drop downs that you want. But as we look here at something like the grant that we have at the line item level, you can see this has its own hyperlink on it. So what this means is if we want to drill into that record, or I could have accessed it through a menu at the top, we can move from a view that's centric to the cost center of the program over to the grant. And so this could be great when you're looking at the budgeting side for the grant. There's some things that are quite important on this side. So when we move over here, it's all the same type of functionality. The main difference is you now see the cost center listed. So what cost center are these coming from? And if we drill down into these areas, we can see the cost centers. But when we look at the timeline over here, so for our Arizona funding here that I have, I'm based out of Arizona. So we'll see, if you had noticed on the other screen, I had a July start of fiscal year. This funding starts in October in my example. So what we'll see is the timeline when you're working from the grant side is going to follow the timeline of that grant. You could set the timeline differently on each grant record.
And then I know we have two questions that I wanted to launch the last poll question as you're doing it. Obviously, the one that any webinar, would you like someone to reach out for additional discussions around your budget process? So there were two questions that were asked. I lost my question. One was, Brian, have you guys had success? Some nonprofits obviously have their proprietary databases. Have you had success integrating them? And I know you guys do have, at the end of the day, there's an import function of actuals.
Right. Proprietary database for the accounting system or from some other statistical system? I'd probably have to know what that is. I mean, we have a lot of flexibility, so we can build, at the end of the day, we have those manual import exports. We have a scheduled flat file transfer if we need to use that. So if that solution can provide a flat file export, we can always do an automated integration, or you could always just do a one-off import at the times you need the data. So there's a lot of flexibility around those.
All right, and then the last question is for the team at UNA. We are recording this, correct? And it can be shared because I think some members of management who might want to hear this were not able to attend the webinar today.
We are recording it, in fact, and we can send out the link, so we'd be happy to do that. All right, I think that brings us to a close.
So thank everybody for taking the time. Feel free, our information was contained in the deck that's a part of this and part of the recording. Feel free to reach out to Brian or myself. Us here at Forvis, we're more than happy to help you with your budget process, helping you find other software solutions, or kind of, like I said, anything outside of audit and tax. Our team does specialize in nonprofits, so we're more than happy to help. And obviously, we can help you with Questica and making sure that's up and running so your organization has the data it needs.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And just a final mention that unisolutions.com if you're looking for us, whether it's the budgeting, procurement, grants management application. So as I mentioned, we focus on nonprofit, public sector, and education. So we've built software solutions that are specific to the needs of those types of organizations. And we thank everybody for joining in today. Hopefully this was helpful, give you some different things to think about in your budgeting process. Thanks so much.